if we were to conduct a survey of all 7 billion of us, and were to ask the question, what is it that you really want? There would initially be a variety of answers. That is, what is it you initially want over and above the basic requirements of life? The answers would be an intimate relationship, more money, a home, a family, education, a variety of such objects. And if we were then to ask, but why do you want these? The answer would have to be, because I want to be happy. Contained in the desire for these various objects is the belief that the acquisition of one of these objects would deliver that for which we truly long. In fact, it is not the object, the state, the substance, the activity, the relationship that we truly want. What all human beings really long for is simply to be happy. Whether we are seeking an object, a state, a relationship, enlightenment, whatever it is we are seeking, we are basically seeking one thing alone: happiness. Now, at some stage, it may dawn on us, either spontaneously or pointed out by a friend, that whenever we experience happiness, it is always the same experience. The happiness that we experienced when we were 5 years old, 15 years old, 20, 30 years old, was always the same experience. There isn't a Lego kind of happiness. Passing my exams kind of happiness. A chocolate happiness. A sex happiness. A getting married happiness. A getting divorced happiness. Happiness is always the same experience. Moreover, we may also notice that often the very object, substance, activity, or relationship that once made us happy can, at another time, make us unhappy. These two facts of experience should be enough to convince us that the experience of happiness is not delivered by an object, a substance, a state, an activity, or a relationship. Having said that, it does seem to be an undeniable fact of experience that when we acquire one of these objects or substances or relationships, we do seem to experience happiness. So, how to reconcile this apparent contradiction? The experience of happiness, for which all human beings deeply long, is obviously not delivered by an object. At the same time, we do seem to experience happiness when we get the object of our desire. How to reconcile this? By understanding the mechanism of desire. As the poet Thoreau said, most people live their lives in a state of quiet desperation. That state of quiet desperation is a more or less subtle activity of resistance and seeking. Resisting what is present, seeking what is not present. This resisting, seeking activity propels us out of the now into time, into the past or the future. And this seeking activity, by definition, has an object, and by an object I mean in general an object, a substance, an activity, a relationship, has an object as its goal. We are seeking an object with the sole purpose of experiencing happiness by acquiring it. When we acquire the object, the substance, the relationship, the seeking activity, by definition, comes to an end. And with the end of the seeking activity, the seeking thought, that is the mind, ceases, and at that moment, we experience happiness. What has actually happened is that the mind has come briefly to an end, and the happiness which was in fact lying ever present underneath the seeking mind shines for a brief moment. In fact, it is not a brief moment, it is a timeless moment, because in the absence of mind, there is no time. When thought reappears, it notices the change, the experience of happiness has taken place, and thought attributes the experience of happiness to the acquisition of the object. Thought says, it is because I acquired that particular object, or that particular activity, or that particular relationship, that I became happy. As a result, through this repeated cycle of desire and the fulfillment of desire, thought believes, as most of us do, that happiness is acquired through, that happiness is experienced as a result of acquiring an object, state, or relationship. And most people's lives are spent going from one object to another, to another, to another, to another, experiencing brief moments of happiness each time the desired object is acquired, and then inevitably experiencing unhappiness when the desired object is taken away. At some point, it becomes clear to us that the happiness for which we long in life doesn't belong to the objects of the mind, the body, or the world. It just doesn't live there. At some stage, we have been failed often enough by objects, by activities, by relationships, that we begin to suspect that happiness may not reside there. And we very often turn to religious or spiritual means as an alternative. We replace the search for objects and relationships with the search for enlightenment, which is just conceived as a kind of super object. The ultimate experience that is finally going to deliver what we've been longing for all these years. We go to a teacher or a series of teachers. As before, we experience brief moments of happiness. But sooner or later, we find ourselves in the same position. In the privacy of our hearts, we still feel that something is missing. Not even our spiritual teaching has really delivered what we want. So where does happiness reside? It is an undeniable experience. Every one of us in this room knows intimately the experience of happiness and loves it above all else. And yet at the same time, it is an obvious fact of experience, if we look clearly enough, that happiness can never be achieved by acquiring an object, substance, state, activity, or relationship. Where else can it reside? It can only reside in that which is not an object. It resides in the simple knowing of our own being. In fact, it doesn't reside in the knowing of our own being. The knowing of our own being, its knowing of itself, is the experience of happiness. Simply to know our own being as it is itself the experience of peace or happiness. When this becomes clear to us, a kind of turning around takes place. We stop investing our desire for security, love, and happiness in an object or relationship. And that desire turns around and faces in the opposite direction, the objectless direction, which is the direction of our own being. Our essential being is simply to be and to know, to be and to be aware. Nobody can deny the presence of themselves. Nobody can deny I am. And nobody can deny that the I that I am knows that I am. These two qualities, apparent qualities, to be and to be aware, are our essential nature, often referred to simply as awareness. Ness meaning the presence of, or the being of. So the word awareness simply means the presence of that which is aware. More commonly known as I. When we know ourselves, that is, when awareness simply knows itself as it is, that is the experience of peace or happiness. And in fact, awareness never ceases to know itself as it is. Not only that, awareness in fact never knows anything other than itself. When I say awareness, I mean you, I. That with which you are knowing this very experience. That essential knowing being never ceases to know itself. And thus never ceases to experience its own nature of peace and happiness. How then is it possible for us to sometimes experience happiness and sometimes experience unhappiness? If our essential nature is always only knowing its own being as it is, how is it possible for us to cease experiencing peace or happiness? It happens like this. Our essential nature of ever-present, unlimited, indivisible awareness vibrates within itself and rises as thought. That thought, all thought, is made only out of eternal, infinite awareness. But thought imagines that awareness shares the limits of the body. In other words, for thought imagines that what we essentially are shares the properties or the qualities that belong to the body. In other words, the temporary, limited qualities that belong to the body. And as such, thought imagines that what we essentially are is a temporary, limited self. It is with this thought, the separate I thought, that equates or identifies our essential being of pure awareness with the body, that the apparently separate self comes into existence. All the unhappiness we experience is for that imaginary separate self. It is that imaginary self that goes out into time, which is itself imagined with thought, seeking happiness. So the happiness-seeking thought is like a character in a movie that travels the world seeking the screen. And it is endlessly frustrated because what it is seeking for is not in the movie. The character in the movie is made out of the apparently limited character in the movie is made out of the unlimited screen. But to begin with, the character doesn't realize that. For the character, the screen is invisible. Although it is made out of the screen, it cannot see the screen because it is looking in the direction of objects. In other words, the absence of the screen is only for the illusory character in the movie. So the separate self is like the character in the movie. Although it is made only out of ever-present, unlimited awareness, from its own illusory point of view, awareness and the happiness that is innate in it seems to be missing, and that veiling of happiness propels the imaginary self out into time, into the past and the future, seeking happiness. The separate self, the apparently separate self, acquires the object or relationship. At that moment, its seeking comes to an end. When its seeking comes to an end, the separate self comes to an end. And with the ending of the separate self, our true nature of pure happiness shines. At a certain point in our lives, we have the courage and the clarity to see that what we have deeply longed for all our lives can never, by definition, be found in any kind of object, state, substance, activity, or relationship. And as a result of this realization, there is a kind of turning around. And it is this turning around and facing the source of the seeking thought, the awareness from which it arises, with which it is known and out of which it is made. It is this turning around that is the dissolution of the separate self, which is synonymous with the experience of peace, happiness, or love. This apparent turning around of the separate self, and of course it is only apparent, this apparent turning around of the separate self is described variously in different spiritual traditions. Self-remembering, the knowing of our own being, the practice of the presence of God, holding on to the I am, self-inquiry. All of these are various ways that various spiritual traditions describe this turning around, or more accurately, this sinking of the mind into the heart, this dissolution of the mind into the heart of pure awareness. All 7 billion of us are longing for that experience alone. The simple knowing of our own being as it is, its knowing of itself. Unveiled or unapparently veiled by the limitations that thought and feeling superimpose upon it. This simple knowing of our own being is not an extraordinary experience. In fact, it is not an experience. It doesn't show up in the mind, the body, or the world. just as the screen doesn't show up in the image. And yet, just as the substance of all images is the screen, so the substance of all experience, of all apparently temporary, finite experience, is ever-present, infinite awareness. All experience shines with the light of pure knowing. And that is what we are. So is there anything you'd like to discuss?
Listening to some of the other speakers today, they seem to suggest that this awakening is just a spontaneous thing that's going to happen or not. Listening to you, though, it seems that you can take part in a process that will encourage that.
Yes, I didn't hear any of the other talks today. But once the separate I thought has arisen, so our essential nature is just pure awareness, ever-present, without limits, indivisible, knowing only its own being, peace itself. It is that awareness that rises as the thought which imagines that awareness is identical to the body. In other words, that imagines that awareness is not unlimited and ever-present, but imagines that it is limited and temporary. With that thought, which is itself made out of awareness, with that thought, the qualities, if we can call them qualities, that belong to awareness, ever-present, without limits, inherently peaceful, seem to be veiled. In other words, the peace of our true nature seems to be veiled with the arising of the separate I thought. Once that has taken place, we are, by definition, compelled to seek in time for the peace and happiness that seems to be missing. It is not possible for an apparently separate self not to seek. In fact, the separate self is not an entity that seeks. It is the very activity of resisting or seeking. So, once the belief and the subsequent feeling of separation is present, seeking is not an option. It's not possible to say, okay, I know I'm a separate self, but there's nothing to do, there's no practice to undertake. The separate self is, by definition, practicing. Most of the time it's doing a sadhana of objects, seeking happiness in objects. Sooner or later, the separate self begins to be disillusioned by the ability of objects, relationships, etc., to produce happiness. So the separate self starts looking in the spiritual traditions for a subtler object, a wonderful samadhi, enlightenment or whatever. And if the separate self carries on that search and becomes disillusioned, it eventually will, there's only one direction for it to turn towards, which is the directionless direction, towards the source of itself. So the debate as to whether or not there is something for the separate self to do is meaningless. It is not possible for the separate self not to seek. It has two options, either to seek in the realm of objects or to seek in the realm of the objectless direction. Those are the only two alternatives for the separate self. Anyone who says, I feel I'm a separate self, but there's nothing to do, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to seek, is simply fooling themselves. It would be much better as a separate self, instead of appropriating the non-dual teaching and saying as a result, there's nothing to do, there's no sadhana to undertake. It would be much better for the separate self to be honest about its situation. I feel separate. I feel lonely. I long for happiness. In the privacy of my heart, I am suffering. I feel sorrow. There's this wound in my heart, and I want to get rid of it. That's honest. There's nothing wrong with that. If the separate self appropriates the non-dual teaching and washes a veneer of Advaita over itself and says there's nobody here and there's nothing to do, it's just burying its pain deeper in the body. And in the privacy of one's own being, in those moments when one lies awake in the middle of the night or when one's attention is not engaged with objects, this suffering will bubble up. This ancient sorrow will bubble up, and it will compel us at some stage to be honest, to seek happiness again. So it would be more honest for the separate self to, of course, the separate self is ultimately an illusion. I'm making a concession to the belief that the separate self is real. But if we are unhappy, we believe the separate self is real. Whatever Advaita beliefs we may have, we believe in the separate self if we are suffering. So as that apparently suffering self, the very highest thing we can do, the ultimate thing the apparently separate self can do, is to seek its source.
Hi, Rupert.
Hi.
I like the question, and I really appreciated your answer. It seems like you're saying that we can't help but seek. And
It's even more than that. It's not that, sorry to interrupt, it's not that we can't help but seek. The separate self is the activity of seeking happiness. The separate self is the search for happiness.
Okay.
If we think that we are a separate self that is not in search, we simply haven't looked close enough at ourselves. We simply haven't noticed that there is this subtle rejection of the now taking place, this resistance of the now taking place, which propels us into time in search of happiness. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, but I like that. Because I see that I can't not seek.
Yep.
I don't have any choice about it.
As a separate self, yes. As an apparently separate self.
Right.
Your own nature, your true being of open, empty, luminous awareness, it is never in search. It's always at rest in its own being. Right now, what you essentially are is just at rest in its own being. But the self that we imagine ourselves to be, that thought imagines ourselves to be, is always in search. I interrupted you again, I'm sorry.
My question, though, on top of that, is I seem to have heard in many different ways that seeking doesn't get us any closer to the thing that we're seeking. And I hear that you seem to be saying that we can't help but we are seeking.
It's true that from an ultimate point of view, seeking doesn't get us closer. However, if we are seeking, we don't know that. If you knew that the activity of seeking wouldn't take you one step closer to the happiness for which you long, your seeking would come to an end then.
Yes.
Now, why doesn't it? Because we don't know. As that seeking self, we may have taken an Advaita belief that we heard in a meeting or read in a book. Seek, there's nothing to seek, there's nobody there, thought can't, blah, blah, blah. We may believe that. We may even have an intuition that it is true. However, if it is not our experience, we cannot claim it. We are compelled to seek, and we are by definition seeking something that is other than ourself. In other words, the object, the substance, the state, the relationship, even enlightenment, is a search for something which is conceived as separate or other than ourself.
What I'm hearing is it's beside the point whether seeking gets me there or not.
Yes, exactly. It's beside the point. It's a meaningless question. Is there something for the separate self to do? It's a distraction. It's a meaningless question. The real question, once we have given provisional credence to the separate self, once we believe and feel that there is a separate self there, the real question is not whether or not there is something for me to do, but rather what is the best thing for me to do? In what direction can I truly turn to for happiness? And as a separate self, we have to go out into the world of objects. I don't necessarily mean physical objects. I mean objects, substances, states, etc. We have to go as far as each of us needs to go in order to become disillusioned, in order to have been failed sufficiently often by relationships, by activities, by states, by samadhis, by teachings, by everything, to turn in the ultimate direction, to ask the ultimate question, the ultimate question that the separate self can ask. What is my source? Where do I come from? What is my real nature? That is the moment the separate self turns round. It is beautifully illustrated in the story of the prodigal son. The son leaves the kingdom, goes away from his father. This is the separate self moving away from its source, and it goes out into the world of objects, and he goes to the end of his tether. He experiences everything that's on offer in the world of objects. He ends up eating the pig's food, you remember? Yeah. And finally, when there's nowhere else to go, what does he do?
Goes back to
he turns round.
Right.
He turns round and faces the Father. Right. That is the moment when the separate self turns in the directionless direction. Now, that is the last act the separate self does. It's the last act the apparently separate self does. And you remember in the story, the separate self does not go towards the Father. He just turns round. It is the Father that goes running to meet him. The Father places on him the purple robe of love. So this is why Krishnamurti titled one of his books, The First and Last Freedom. The last freedom we have is when we seem to cease being pure awareness, when we seem to cease knowing our own being and the peace that is inherent there, when we seem to rise as a separate self and as a result turn away from ourself, that's the original ignorance, the original sin, and go out into the world of objects. That is our last freedom. We give up our freedom when we do that. But the first freedom we always have as a separate self is to turn around. It is the ultimate thing the separate self does, the illusory separate self. But if we feel we are a separate self, we are not in a position to call it an illusion. If we feel we are a separate self, the separate self is real. And one of the ways the sense of separation perpetuates itself, particularly on the contemporary non-dual scene, is by appropriating the Advaita teaching and saying, there's nobody here, there's nothing to do. Most people adopt that message, most people in our era adopt that message far too early in their search. I'm no longer seeking, there's nobody here, there's nothing to do. It's true, ultimately. But most of us adopt it far too early, and as a result simply bury our pain deeper in the body.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that if we do seek in the highest form to turn around and look within, it is possible to make that connection, that path can lead to.
It seems like making a connection, but when you say a connection, you're talking about a connection between a separate self and the real self.
Right.
There's no connection between the separate self and the real self,
Okay.
because there is only one reality. There is only one self, if we can call it a self, and that is ever-present, unlimited awareness. That is the only self there ever is. Pure awareness. It is thought alone, which imagines that awareness shares the destiny and the limits of the body. And with that thought, our essential nature of pure awareness seems to become temporary and limited. And with that apparent collapse of ourself into the body, it's like a contraction into the body. With that collapse or contraction, the happiness that is innate, that is the knowing of our own being, is veiled. And that is why the separate self is compelled to search. It has no other option. So it's not really a connection that the separate self makes. It is a dissolution of the beliefs, and much more importantly, the feelings. The dissolution of belief is not enough. Only 10% of the separate self consists of beliefs of separation. The other 90% are feelings in the body. It is when the beliefs and the feelings of separation dissolve that the true and only self of pure awareness shines as it is. That is why Ramana Maharshi said, when the I is divested of the I, only I remain. When the true and only I of eternal infinite awareness is divested of all the limitations that thoughts and feelings superimpose upon it, it stands revealed as the I that it eternally is.
So just one more question. And I use the wrong word, I connect with.
Sure, no, I understand why you use that, and it's a perfectly legitimate word to use.
I just want to be clear over here that you're saying if I do seek in this highest form to turn around and look within,
Yeah.
it is possible to achieve whatever we call this, awakening?
It's, well, I don't use the word awakening, so it's not really awakening. It's more like a revelation of something that is always there but seemingly veiled. It's not an awakening or enlightenment for a self or for it's just it's like this. Imagine you're watching a movie on TV, and the movie is so interesting, so enjoyable that you're totally involved with it. And what you see is people, houses, cars, traffic, buildings, sky, fields, trees, etc. In other words, you see a multiplicity and diversity of objects. And then at some stage, either spontaneously or at the suggestion of a friend, you realize, I'm not seeing a multiplicity and diversity of objects. I'm seeing a single screen. Did you suddenly start seeing the screen when you had that realization? No. You had been seeing the screen all along. But you thought you were seeing a collection of objects. The screen isn't suddenly revealed. It doesn't suddenly appear in the movie. All you were ever seeing was the screen. So that's why I say it's more like a revelation than an awakening. Oh, nothing against the word awakening, it's just not the word I use particularly. It's more like, and some people say it's sudden. Some people say it's gradual. It's neither. It's timeless. In this knowing of our own being, there is no mind. Pure awareness knows itself in the absence of the body-mind. It knows itself by itself, through itself, in itself, as itself. There is no mind present there. So there is no question of it awakening to itself gradually or suddenly. It is eternally knowing its own being alone. And all of this is that.
Thank you, sir.
I'll ask the same question I asked one of the earlier speakers, and just wanted to have your take on it.
Can you say that again?
I'll ask the same question I asked earlier to one of the other speakers, just wanted your take on it. But once that realization, or awakening as some people call it, has occurred, does that awareness, pure consciousness that's always present, view thoughts, feelings, emotions in a completely different way to the moment prior to that ultimate realization? Are they taken differently?
What was the last bit you said?
Are they taken differently? The feelings, the emotions, the body, the knowledge of the body and the mind and its thoughts, how are they perceived once that realization is occurred?
There is a fundamentally different way of viewing experience. That there is the way the apparently separate self views experience, and there is the way pure awareness views experience. Although, as I've explained, ultimately it's the same self. One is pure awareness, the other is awareness that is apparently veiled. But let's call them the separate self and pure awareness. Yes, there is a fundamentally different way. Let me give you an analogy to make this clear. Go back to the image of the screen and the metaphor of the screen and the movie. Only imagine that the screen it's a magical screen. It's an aware screen. Okay, so we're no longer sitting on the sofa watching the movie. The screen is aware. The screen is watching the movie that is taking place on it. Yeah? The screen it has no limits. It's got no frame around it. It's a limitless screen. Now, this screen in the metaphor is pure knowing being. Yeah? Now, before the movie starts, this limitless screen, pure awareness, is just knowing its own being. It doesn't know itself as an object. It just knows its own being. Not by doing anything, just by being itself, it knows itself. And this knowing of our own being is the experience that shines in our mind as the experience I am. The experience I am is a reflection in the mind of this transparent knowing of our own being, which is just the nature of our essential self. Now, when the movie starts, that is, when the appearance of the mind, when the mind, the body, and the world appear, the screen continues to experience only itself. Yes? Let's say a landscape appears on the screen. From the screen's point of view, the landscape is just a modulation of itself, a temporary modulation of itself. The screen doesn't need the landscape. It doesn't want the landscape. It doesn't like or dislike the landscape. It just experiences it as itself. In other words, it doesn't experience it as a landscape. The screen doesn't know a collection of objects, trees, fields, the sun, mountain, etc. The screen doesn't know separate objects. It just knows itself. Now, in the movie, a group of people appear walking through the landscape. Now, from the point of view of one of those people, one of the characters in the movie, there are a multiplicity and diversity of objects. When the character in the movie looks around, it sees trees and fields and people and mountains and flowers and animals. In other words, from the point of view of the character in the movie, the character seems to experience things that are separate from or other than itself. The character in the movie is the separate subject of experience. The objects, all the other objects and people are separate objects, other, or world. So the character in the movie experiences an outside world and an inside self. Separate people, separate objects, separate others. However, the character in the movie is only a real character in the movie from its own illusory point of view. In other words, the separate self is only a separate self from the illusory point of view of a separate self. For the true and only self of pure awareness, it only ever is and knows itself alone. The common name for that experience is love or beauty. Love is the experience of not knowing an other. We know that. We all know that. What happens when you fall in love or when you love? You feel that you and the other collapse or merge. Love is the experience that there is no separate subject of experience and no separate other in experience. So love is the name we commonly give to this collapse of the subject-object relationship in relation to people. Beauty is exactly the same experience, but in relation to objects. In other words, love is all pure awareness knows. For the separate self, love is the condition of one or two special relationships. But for pure awareness, the only one that truly knows, it is the natural condition of all experience.
One very quick follow-up to that. So, the separate body, mind, once that's realized as not self, once it on death of the physical form, when the body actually dies, does it remain? Does the awareness stay without the defilement of? I hesitate to use this word, but with the possibility of reincarnation.
So it's a little difficult to hear this, Mike. The question is, when the body dies, does awareness remain? Implicit in your question is that awareness is a property of the body-mind. That it is the body-mind that is aware. That's the underlying presumption in your question. Body-minds are not aware. Awareness is aware. And awareness doesn't need a body or a mind in order to be aware of itself. It is aware of itself by itself, through itself, in itself. So you say when the body dies, but the body, if we stay close to our experience, the body is a collection of sensations and perceptions that are continually coming and going. We don't have to wait for death to experience the disappearance of the body. All we know of a body are sensations and perceptions. And sensations and perceptions are always vanishing. But nobody has ever had the experience of the disappearance of awareness. It's not possible. In other words, for awareness, which is the only one who truly knows, if we ask awareness, do you ever experience the appearance or disappearance of yourself? Awareness, if it could speak, will always say no. In other words, in awareness's own experience of itself, it is ever present. It doesn't appear, or it wasn't born, and it doesn't disappear, it doesn't die. It is birth and death are for thought, not for awareness. It is only the thought that imagines that awareness is identical to the body, that it thinks awareness was what I am was born when the body was born. I move, change, evolve, grow old, grow sick, and will one day die. It is only for thought that is a married awareness with the body that believes that what I am will die when the body dies. And it is that presumption that is behind your question, does awareness continue after the death of the body? No, awareness doesn't continue. Awareness is not everlasting. It is eternally present now. Awareness doesn't know time. It doesn't experience time. When I talk about awareness, I'm talking about you. You, the one that knows your experience, has no knowledge of your own appearance or disappearance. Death and birth are concepts for the mind. They are not experiences for yourself.
James, two minutes.
Definitely short this time. What you're saying is a process. You're making a process of helping people to understand the actuality.
Yes,
And
there
I
is a
really respect
process
that.
for the apparent self. The apparent separate self, there is a process.
And I really respect that. And, this is the kind of thing that is needed, is that you are clearly, expressing things like Krishnamurti, basically, directly to the truth. And that really points out that we are all vehicles to express things into the world. Where there is no self, but there's still, a personality, and there's still certain talents or certain abilities, and what you're doing is, what is the thing that is needed now.
Yes,
Definitely.
that there are essentially two possibilities for the body-mind. One is to express the beliefs and feelings of being a temporary, limited self. And the second is to express the understanding that we are ever-present, unlimited awareness. Those are the only two options for the body-mind. Although there is a great deal of variety in the way each of those possibilities is expressed. But at every moment, any body-mind is doing one or other of those two possibilities, either expressing the fears, the demands, the desires, the neuroses, the unhappiness that is inherent in the separate self, or expressing the peace, the love, the intelligence that is innate in the simple knowing of our own being. Those are essentially the two options for the body-mind.
Rupert, thank you very much indeed. That was super. And I think you'll all agree that was a fabulous way to bring our sort of list of speakers to an end. So.